As anglers, we all have our theory on choosing our colors for our lures, and I'm no different, and I'm going to share the system I use to choose lure colors on this episode of Fishful Thinker, the podcast. I'm Chad LaChance, and you're listening to Fishful Thinker, the podcast. All things fishful, all the time. Hey guys, Chad LaChance here. Thanks so much for tuning into this episode of Fishful Thinker, the podcast. Of course, brought to us by Sportsman's Warehouse and Peterson Toyota in Fort Collins, Colorado. The fine folks at Sportsman's Warehouse will ship directly to a store near you. And the Peterson Toyota family are mostly outdoorsmen themselves and know what you need in a truck. Here we are, it's January. It's the third week of January, guys, and I've been going through tackle like crazy. And part of the reason I'm doing that is I pare down at the end of the year. Part of the reason is to get ready for the coming year in terms of stocking. Part of it is just general to keep me busy in the wintertime because I don't ice fish. And I just got done working at the Denver International Sportsman's Expo a couple weeks ago and had several questions about color there, and of course differing opinions came up. And the thing about fishing is there's no wrong answers, but some are better than others, and to stay consistent we've chosen ways to be systematic, let's just say, in the selection of our colors, and at least let the fish prove my system wrong before we get too far off the hook on that. But speaking of too far off the hook, before I get too far from the International Sportsman's Expo, I want to issue a quick apology to the fine fishermen of the Colorado Front Range that may have expected us at the Denver Boat Show. I had made an announcement that I would be there along with Crowley Marine, and I would like to apologize to Crowley Marine and the Denver boaters that were hoping to meet us there. I unfortunately injured my elbow and on Saturday morning of the boat show and was unable to attend. And again, I apologize. I did speak with the folks at Crowley Marine and they were fine. It's the first time in my 20-year career that I've missed an appointment or appearance somewhere. And so if you have boat questions, please send them to me directly. I'll get on the phone with you if I have to, and we'll make it up to the guys at Crowley Marine Boats in Denver here at the earliest opportunity. So thanks for your understanding on that. The elbow is going to be a while before I'm fishing much. Going to slowly let it heal. I injured the bursa sac in the elbow, and I've unfortunately had a bad elbow a couple other times in the past. And it's my casting arm, and so normally I'd be practicing casting some this time of year, but will not be touching much fishing equipment for the next few weeks anyway while we let it heal. So, and to be honest with you, jokes aside, I never really thought I'd get in the fishing industry and be dealing with injuries, but here we are. So anyway, moving forward, color selection. Back to my color selection thing. I already said there's no wrong answers in fishing, and some are better than others. Before I even get going on this, there's a whole bunch of people that are going to have a different opinion on it, and I totally understand that because I've seen a whole bunch of times where really obscure stuff works in fishing to where you're like, wow, that doesn't make any sense, and it works. And that's a really important detail here. But what I look at when choosing color more than anything else is I choose the color that gives me the most confidence as an angler, because confidence does catch fish. So more than there being a specific color or specific system, what I'm looking for when I look in my tackle box and I look in whatever it is, I'm looking at a box of crankbaits and I need to pick which one is the best. And I open that Plano 3700 box and I look in there and I'm, man, look at them all. Whichever one my confidence is going to be is where I'm generally going to head. And my confidence is related to the system that I've slowly but surely built over 20 years of doing this as a professional. So confidence is one of those things that is really hard to put your finger on, but you generally know. And if you, to make my point, if you ever tied a lure on, you make just a couple of casts with it, and you're like, no, that's not right, and you put it down, that's a confidence thing. Reality is, if you'd have thrown it 10 more times, maybe it would have got bit, but you don't know that because your confidence isn't there and you take it off. There's other times where I'll fish a lure even when the fish are beating me to death or somebody's out fishing me because my confidence is in that lure, and the fish will force me to make a change. or you're just a slow learner, one or the other. And I don't like to be a slow learner. So if I go a certain distance and we're not being bit, I will make a change. So, and usually that will come down to something more major than color, but it's still the confidence thing, which is my point. What I'm trying to get at is it's the confidence thing. So much so that when I was guiding a whole bunch, very commonly I get people in the boat and I try to vibe on those people right away. I generally had 2 anglers in the boat, almost always had 2 anglers in the boat. And I want to know, kind of where they're at. And as soon as I get a guy who doesn't, or a woman for that matter, who doesn't exude some confidence in what's going on, I let them start picking their colors. I won't let them pick lures, and I'll get back to that in a minute, but I will let them pick the colors. So I'll flop a box of jerk baits on the deck of the boat in front of them and say, pick whichever one. And invariably they'll be puzzled. Like, well, what do you mean? You're supposed to be the fishing guide. Tell us which one. Well, I wouldn't put that box on the deck of the boat if I didn't know fully that all of those would catch fish on the day we were on. What basically my point being is I know we're on a jerkbait bite, and if you work that jerkbait correctly, it will get bit regardless of the color scheme that we pick, or at least a percentage of it will. And I know you'll work it better if you're more confident in what you're throwing. So I tell them which color gives you the most confidence, pick that one, we'll tie it on. And again, I've already decided as the guide that the jerkbait is what we need to be throwing that day. And this is not about jerkbaits. That's just a case study, but that was a common scenario I would run into because invariably it came down to, as long as I have the right genre of lure, I am in the right ballpark, and that's more often the case. So I've done other podcasts on color before, but again, I make these up, and they're based on questions that I'm currently getting. And so a friend of mine right now was color selections and things. So let's furthermore expand on the color thing with the jerkbait thing I just used. Okay, so I throw the box down and I say, pick whichever one you like, whichever one. They pick whatever color they like, I tie it on. I let the other guy do the same thing. I tie that one on, I let him get to fishing. Also, almost as invariably as having 2 anglers in the boat, one of those 2 will significantly outfish the other. More rare are the days that both anglers catch the same number of fish. Usually one of them will find their twitch and they will do better than the other. And just to establish more confidence in the guy that isn't catching fish, because the guy that is catching fish at a regular rate is obviously got confidence at that point, where the guy that isn't not sure what's up. I will literally hand one rod from one guy, just literally swap the 2 rods. Don't change anything. Just take one out of his hand, give it to him, and vice versa. Also, invariably, the guy that was already catching them now will continue to catch them with the other guy's bait. And I literally, in 20 years of being a licensed guide, never had that backfire in my face. And that speaks to the fact that there's a lot of things that are more important to your fishing than the color of your lure. And that's a big thing. Now, having said that, there's been maybe a half dozen times total in all of my travels, fishing in multiple countries and all over this country, where color was the determining factor, where flat out, it has to be this color. And those were all related to the salmonids, trout or salmon. And other than that, when it came to bass or walleyes or saltwater fish or any of the other species, you can get bit on multiple colors a long range apart on the same day. So the more important things are things like the depth that your lure is running, the speed that your lure is running, the how rhythmically it's running versus how erratically it's running, how much noise it makes versus is it quiet, how many pauses or not pauses or whatever. All of those things make more difference than the color does. So when do I lean only on color as far as making a lure change? Typically when I'm getting a whole bunch of fish that are foul hooked. And by a whole bunch, I mean, say 1 out of every 3 or 4, maybe 5 fish you catch are hooked outside the mouth. That tells me that I'm in the ballpark with my lure. I'm getting their attention. They're coming to get it, but they're missing it. And so typically the first thing I will change for that is the color, because I don't want to change the depth range. I'm drawing strikes. I don't want to change, the speed that it's running. Again, I'm drawing strikes. I don't, all of those things. But the one thing that does get my attention is, well, I'm drawing strikes, but they're not committed strikes such that they're getting lured down their throat. And believe me, if they want it, if they're fully committed to it, unless something is completely erratic and out of shape, like maybe a jerkbait or a jig and spoon, where they literally might miss occasionally, I know that if a largemouth bass wants something in his pie hole, it's going to get in his pie hole. I mean, they're just very, very good at that stuff. Same thing with a walleye or anybody else, and they're very good at it. But if they're not committed to it, they'll bump things. They'll sample something, whatever. It's usually the first thing I'll do is change color in that instance. And usually the change that I make will be tied to the color of the water. So if the water's dirty, stained, or it's a low light condition, I may make my lure stand out more. If the water's clearer, I will make the lure clearer or stand out less. And generally that will make the difference it takes to get fish to be hooked in the mouth versus around the face and the head, things like that. So that's a thing there. So let's talk about more generally how I go about choosing colors. And this is across the board for pretty much all the freshwater fish, and even saltwater fish to some degree as well. So if my water is clear to crystal clear, so in other words, I have, say, 2 feet to unlimited visibility, or maybe 3 feet to unlimited visibility, I can literally throw about whatever color I want, and that's not what you guys want to hear. But the reason I say that is this: I can throw a really bright color, like a hot pink, like a bubblegum pink, or a fluorescent orange, or a fluorescent chartreuse, in a lot of cases in clear water, because I can appeal to fish's aggressiveness. Some classic examples of that. Trout fishing. Everybody loves red and orange for trout fishing. There's a reason Potskey's fireballs are dyed red. They're not red. Salmon eggs are not red when they come out of the salmon. They dye them red so that the trout will key on them. Along those same lines, any northern smallmouth bass angler will tell you chartreuse. Oh, it's got chartreuse. Crystal clear water with a really fast, super bright chartreuse bait is a great way to get smallmouth to attack. Okay, so I can throw the bright colors in a lot of scenarios in the clear or crystal clear water. Conversely, I can also throw clear or translucent baits, which are one of my favorite of all time, is a translucent bait, because I still can throw it with confidence the fish will be able to locate it because the water's clear. So even if in some other scenarios, they're using other things to get near the bait. In other words, they feel it in their lateral line, they hear it in their ears and the otolith bone. Maybe they smell it to find it that way. But at the end of the day, most all the fish are sight feeders, and we've talked about that in a lot of podcasts. Meaning that trout, last thing he does is looks at it before he bites it. Same thing with a bass or anything else. Can they feed in the dark? Of course they can. But if you're fishing in the daylight, you got to count on the fact that the fish really, ultimately, to get them hooked inside the mouth, they need to see your bait well. And I think what happens in a lot of scenarios is the fish are either not committed to biting the bait because they get up on it, they rush up on it. Keep in mind, they're expecting it to flee. They're expecting it to run. And most things they eat don't sit there in front of them. And second, so they get up, they look at it, and then they're not completely sold, but they're maybe sold. So they'll nip at it, right? And they're not really committed to, like, I'm eating that right now. We've all seen a bass pick a worm up by the tail, swim around with it, and then decide, yeah, it's pretty good, and suck the rest of it in, even though he could have easily vacuumed the whole thing in at the same time. That kind of thing is what I'm talking about. The other possibility is they don't see it until the last minute, and they're using their sound or their lateral line to feel the vibration of the lure, so they run at it based on its other signatures than its color, and therefore they just miss because they didn't have enough info or enough data to process their attack perfectly. So those are the scenarios I look at when I'm getting fish that are partially hooked or foul hooked. So when the water's really clear, I can throw the clear bait knowing they can see it, or I can throw the bright bait knowing that I could possibly appeal to their aggressiveness. I can throw the supernatural color and be a match the hatch thing, like a perch color or a shad color, a really distinctly natural looking color. Or I can throw something very shiny and use the strobe effect to my advantage, meaning that, the running joke I've always told for years and years now is they tell, divers in the ocean, they don't wear shiny wristwatches and they don't wear, chrome on the mask anymore like they did in the old days. These days, everything's dull and flat colored. Why? It's not because barracudas like to eat Timexes. It's because that shine will provoke an immediate attack from high-level predators. So when you're underwater and something shiny picks up sun or light and strobes in no difference than a signal mirror would, it's a good way to get bit by a fish who really acts on pure instinct. And that's the biggest thing we got to keep in mind here. These fish are all acting on instinct. So that's a really important thing. So when the water's crystal clear or at least very clear, I can throw all the color scheme. Everything's there. As the water gets darker, or gets less light penetration or more particulates in the water, difference between particulates being like sediment or mud in the water, or it gets more tannin in the water, which is basically like iced tea, where it's fundamentally clear and transparent, but with a tint to it. And in some cases, that tint can get really heavy. Some areas I fish in the South or in Florida will get straight up dark, like dark iced tea color because of all the leaf debris in the water, which is where it comes from. Same reason iced tea is that color. So as we lose light penetration, the fish's ability to see and see details goes away. So now we're relying on other parts of the fish to locate our lure, and those are other discussions for another day. In other words, noise, vibration, all of those things that fish can use, but we need to fine tune our color more to make sure when they do locate it that they can get the best possible strike on it as possible. And in clear water, I'm always hoping that my lure will to some degree sneak up on my fish unless those extreme aggressive examples I already mentioned, like trout with something red or smallmouth with chartreuse in clear water scenarios. Otherwise, 99.5% of the time in clear water, I want my lure to some degree sneak up on my fish. I want it to some degree surprise them because they can see it from a long ways away. Conversely, if I have low light penetration, then I'm the other way around. I want to use everything I can for that fish to help locate that lure, and that is going to include vision. So if the water is stained, you lose the ability to strobe very much. In other words, the less light penetration you have, the less strobe effect you are going to get. And that is particularly in the case of muddy water or particulates. It seems like a fitting word there. So if you have mud, you're in a trout stream and the snow starts melting and it turns muddy. You're fishing, a reservoir somewhere and the boat traffic comes up and it gets all muddy. Anything like that. If you have a heavy-duty algae bloom and there's a bajillion particulates of algae in the water, those things will make the strobe effect go away. And therefore, my chrome goes out the window. All of a sudden, my shiny stuff is not what I'm worried about at all anymore. So those are up. So now I've effectively taken a bunch of my lures out of play right there, or at least as far as color goes. Then the next thing I got to look at from there is anything translucent is also going to go away because there's no definition in the water. When the fish is looking at something, he's not going to see that profile that we so carefully chose. He's not going to see that any of the details really of the bait. If it's a very translucent color, it's going to be lost in its environment. And again, we're going to have fish that flat out miss the bait when they try to attack it because it's not quite what they thought it was. So the translucent and the shiny are both gone. The natural colors, the hyper-natural colors, I should say, something like a really, particularly these days, are literally photographic representations where you can buy baits that they're photo printed right on it. It looks so real. It looks exactly like an actual yellow perch or exactly like a bluegill. In most cases, keep in mind, those fish are designed to hide. So those color schemes are not designed to catch other fish's attention unless they wind that color up with their ability to do that. As you know, fish can light up. They can get phosphorus coloring in them, and they can get a very bright color. You'll hear saltwater guys talk about deep color. You can see a bluegill light up when he's spawning and be a mute, total color when the water is stained, because that's his ability to hide. So a hyper natural color is also not our best choice in a heavily stained water situation, particularly when it comes to particulates because of the low light penetration. So now my hyper natural colors are also out the window. So the easier way to choose, or the easiest watercolor to choose lures for, in my opinion, is the darkest water you can get. The most stained, the most dirty, the most whatever water you can get for me is easy, because then I know I need a big, solid, bold color. No matter what species it is, I need some kind of a big color, and I can eliminate 3/4 of my box right off the bat. So depending on what's causing the stain, I will choose a color that's a good antidote to that. So if I'm dealing with algae in the water that's causing it, well, now I know I have a ton of green in the water, and so I can pick something that's a good contrast to that. I'm probably going to go with a hot orange or something like that. If I've got a ton of mud stain in the water, I'm probably going to go the opposite and go with a big chartreuse, which might not show up in the algae water, but will show up in the mud. So a big chartreuse color, something like that. So I'll choose my lure color to again pop against the watercolor that I'm dealing with in the ecosystem right there. Now, another possibility, and is a good universal color in my opinion, why it's one of the most particular or popular colors of all time, is white or black, because either of those are obviously, besides being the extreme ends of the spectrum, they stand up well in a lot of watercolors, yet they're still natural. So it's easy to see why black and white are both very popular colors with lures. Particularly white more so, I think, because of its baitfish resemblance, but I've seen a whole bunch of scenarios where pure black lures do really good, or mostly black lures, very dark colored lures do very well. And that's something that is because it's natural, but yet it shows up really good in stained water situations. So black or white are always a choice in heavily stained, particulate stained water. Looking at tannin stained water, which is far more translucent, definitely allows more light penetration, but with a distinct tint to it, also easier to choose lures. In that case, you may be able to get away with some shiny stuff, pure chromes, pure golds, but I want as heavy of a strobe effect as possible if I'm going to go that route, as opposed to a solid color more like I would for particulate stain. And the detail there is this: I want big, flat surfaces to reflect. In other words, what I'm trying to do is make my brightest strobe I can. So if I've got a hammered finish, let's say, or a scale pattern printed on something, that's going to diffuse a bunch of the light. But if I have a big flat piece of chrome, big obviously being relative to the lure, a big chrome, heavy duty chrome thing with flat surfaces on it, those are going to strobe very hard, and that will still work for you in tannin stained water. Most of the time tannin stain's got a yellow tint, and I'm going to head for gold, because any of the baitfish that would be shiny in the real world are also gold tinted from the stain. The slime coat on the fish will pick up the tint from the water and will make all the fish look gold. So if you catch let's say you catch a snook, one of my favorite fish of all, probably my favorite fish of all. If you catch one way up in the intercoastal somewhere where there's a lot of tannin stain, he'll be very, very yellow in color. You catch that same fish in the Gulf of Mexico, a mile downstream, all of a sudden he's pure silver. And you realize that, oh, okay, they pick up the color of the water they're in, which is why any lure that I'm going to throw in the tannin stain will typically be gold chrome rather than silver chrome, which is what I would throw in clear water. So again, I'm trying to systemize this. None of these are 100% answers, right? Any given day, all of a sudden that gold chrome can work really good in clear water, and vice versa. But I try to keep it as close to a system as I can, and again, let the fish prove me wrong. So when I'm dealing with tannin stained water, I'll either choose a hot solid color or a very shiny lure, but not a slightly shiny lure. And so those are really your scenarios. Then the last one is dark, like it's pure dark outside. We're talking night fishing. Well, if you have relatively clear water and a moon, yes, you can still use the strobe effect to your advantage, and I've done a fair bit of that on my home lake. But and just for the record, on a side note, you can also use shade lines, same in the moon as you can in the daylight for shade lines, if you have clear water scenario. But if you have stained water, and you're fishing at night, then we generally need a lure with the strongest profile we can possibly get, and that's for sure going to be a solid color. And in my scenario, it's going to be pure black, and that's a little bit counterintuitive to what you might think. But when you're underneath it and looking up, and we're counting on the fact that a high percentage of fish are feeding up, they're going to get a profile look of your bait. And if your bait's on the bottom, it'll contrast the bottom. If your bait's on the top and they're looking up at it, or higher in the column than the fish, they're going to be looking at it against the night sky. White reflects all the color, all the light, which is why it's white, but there may not be enough light for white to show up. So the other possibility would be a glow-in-the-dark lure of some sort. I have not had that be effective enough that I even carry them anymore. But I did try it, and I did try it for several years, and just never could make it pan out. So most of the time at night, I'm going with a straight dark color, unless it's like solid black, unless we've got some sort of light penetration from the moon, or maybe I'm fishing around dock lights or marinas, something like that. Then you can count on a strobe effect as well. But for me, I basically carry only 3 ranges of colors, and it's going to be the 2 chromes, the gold chrome and the silver chrome. Those are the 2 that I throw anytime we're throwing chrome, and silver chrome gets the nod more often than not. When it comes to my really hot colors, I love a solid chartreuse, and I love a solid hot orange of some sort, or potentially a hot red color of some sort for my solid colors, for stained water, things like that, or maybe even a fire tiger, which is chartreuse and black on top of each other. Mans used to make a good fire tiger in a 1- way back in the day. I was married to that thing. That color in pure stained water got me a lot of bites back in the day. Very important that color was around and strong in my career. Then I'll always carry solid blacks of whatever and solid whites of whatever, or a pearl white of pretty much whatever lure it is. And then I'll carry a couple of natural ones. To be honest with you, for me, the natural colors are typically reserved for the slowest baits in my box, because the fish are going to get the most time to look at them. So my famous gulp minnow that everybody thinks I'm married to, and I am, it's my #1 lure of all time. Almost all the fish I've caught on that over the years, a very high percentage of them have been in the smelt color, which is because it's the most natural color of it all. Why? Because that's not a bait I throw when we have a bunch of heavy stain in the water. Will it catch fish? Of course it will. But there's other ways to help fish attract to my lure with flash and vibration, things like that. And so generally speaking, when I'm throwing something as innocuous as a gulp minnow, I'm in a clear water situation anyway, and a very natural color for me there gets the job done. If you're dealing with a spawning smallmouth or something like post-spawn smallmouth, then yeah, maybe a really hot chartreuse or something will draw you bites. But those are key things. There's a couple other key things about choosing colors that I think are important for people to keep in mind. And again, I don't want to hate mail. I understand you may have your favorite system. I'm just trying to give you some way to systemize it. And it makes it easier to buy lures as well, because I will buy a natural one and a hot color one, or I'll buy a shiny one and a translucent one, or something like that when I'm buying lures, as opposed to buying a brown one and a green one, which are too close together as far as I'm concerned. And I have now covered less bases with those 2 lures than if I bought say a brown one and a white one, or something like that, or a green one and a white one, or whatever the case might be. So I will generally buy them based on that. I am not typically a match the hatch guy when it comes to colors very much. Generally speaking, if there's enough fish around bait fish around that I'm worried about matching the hatch, I know I've got feeding fish, and a lot of times I want my lure to stand out. So if everybody's, if I know there's a bunch of baby bluegills and I know largemouth are feeding on all these bluegills, well, I'll pick an accent color of the bluegill and run with that, as opposed to trying to match that bluegill perfectly in a lot of scenarios. So a couple generalities I'm going to go with really quick. If you're a largemouth guy and the water's stained, it's hard to beat black and blue. That's just me. Black and sapphire blue, or black and blue in general, is a fantastic color combination in heavily stained water for largemouth bass. That trout, anytime I'm dealing with trout, always in the ballpark could be an orange, a red, or a pink, and those colors will be fine-tuned. Maybe it's a really bright orange as opposed to a muted down orange, or maybe it's a really bright pink as opposed to just a off pink, depending on the watercolor. But I'll have some hue of those in there, and that's because salmonids see those colors better than they see other colors. A touch of chartreuse always gives a trigger point. I always like those in almost any scenario, but when I say a touch, I do mean a touch, not a bunch of chartreuse, a tiny hint of chartreuse, which you will see a lot of the sunfish family display if you tilt them just right. And there's something else I'm really big on, and that's a false eye. A false eye meaning like the spot you see on a shad, and that's really important because it's an instinctive thing for the fish. The reason that so many things that get eaten in nature have false eyes is they're trying to draw the attack to somewhere else, and rather than their actual eyes and head, which is very vulnerable for them. So a shad has a false eye. If you're a bird hunter, I'm gonna tell you about this. Here's how the false eye works on a shad. They try to get the fish to miss based on him keying on that false eye instead of the actual eye. So it's basically an aiming point for the fish, or the butterflies that have false eyes, or all the other animals in the world that have false eyes. In other words, a part of their coloration designed to look like a different eyeball. You're a bird hunter. Rooster pheasant gets up. I was always taught to shoot at the ring on the rooster. Don't shoot at the rooster, shoot at the ring on his neck. Why is that? That's because you're automatically then leading the bird, and it becomes an aim small, miss small thing. Well, if a pheasant got up and he had a ring at the back of the bird and you shot at it, it's going to mess the whole thing up. And when I'm thinking about a shad, if a fish is aiming for the false eye, he's already in the wrong spot in terms of the aim in the first place. The shad has got him confused to some degree, and therefore he might miss. And he's banking on that. And there's a reason that so many of them, bluegills have the bluegill, so to speak, which is a form of a false eye, and pumpkin seeds have it. A lot of other species do as well, and it's made there to be an aiming point to mess up the other fish, and therefore I want my lures to have that because when a fish is looking at something, a false eye is almost like a clue that something is edible in the first place, and that's a key thing. So I like false eyes a lot, to the point where I'll take a Sharpie and draw them on lures that didn't come with one. I've been known to paint a false eye on a chrome spoon, just a really distinct black spot on a chrome spoon, so that when the spoon moves around, the fish can see it. Soft plastic, same thing. A lot of cases, jig heads with eyes on them will automatically create a false eye when you put a rubber body that's got built-in eyes on it, right? So now you have two eyes on the same side of the bait, you have a false eye scenario. So there's a lot of scenarios like that. So I'm running long, guys. I'm going to kind of tie this one up because, again, there's no wrong answers in fishing. It's some answers are better than others. This is the system I've more or less put in place so that I can glance at the water, glance at the sky, and say, this is the ballpark I'm in right here. And again, I'll fish that until the fish prove to me I'm wrong. So I appreciate you guys tuning in. Once again, apologize that I missed you at the Denver Boat Show if you were going to be there. I'll get my elbow healed up here and hopefully won't miss things like that in the future. So if you want to join the conversation at Fishful Thinker, Facebook, Instagram, TikTok, and especially YouTube, we'd appreciate that. Thanks for tuning in. This has been Fishful Thinker, the podcast.